Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event on the launch of the Global Labor Resilience Index 2019. And before we actually launch the results, because this is the moment when we launch the results, I had a question for you. What do you think that this picture represents? Any?
The Milky Way.
The Milky Way would be one. DNA, excellent. Blockchain, the future of connectivity. We'll not mention some coins that are associated to that. It also represents the power of networks in terms of how that can build resilience. And it represents connecting the dots, which was the point made by Mr. Fadi Farah. And when we're talking about labor resilience and labor market resilience, in the end, one of the things that is fundamental here is how are we connecting the dots, how are we using networks in order to strengthen the power of labor markets to function. So we're going to go straight into the results, and then I'll explain to you what these results mean. And it's launched now. Okay, so we have a ranking of more than 120 countries. And the number one country in the world, in terms of labor resilience, is Singapore. Number two, Switzerland. Not because we're in Davos. We were not bribed on that, but it is Switzerland. What do you think number three would be? Ooh, that's pretty close. Number three is the United States of America in the current state of affairs, with a tremendous progress that has happened. I don't know if it happened in the last 5 years, but certainly in the last 10 years. Number four, Denmark. Who would be number five? That would be slightly subjective, Christopher. So Norway is probably going to come up at some point. Finland is number five. Number six, Sweden. Number seven, Iceland. Number eight, Luxembourg, with the particularities of Luxembourg. And number 9, the Netherlands. Number 10, Norway. So Norway was in the top 10, you were absolutely right. And there are many more other countries. Now, can you already detect a first pattern here in terms of the top 10, in terms of labor resilience, labor market resilience?
It needs snow.
There's something the Nordic countries are doing which seems to be right. Okay, and it relates to things that we can discuss later during the dinner, but there's something out there because there's about 5 of them in there. Now, of course, there are other countries involved. And this is a top 30, and I'm really sorry that you can't see the screen, because it is top 30, but I can highlight a few for you if you would like. So we have Belgium, which was in the top 10, which is now in number 11. We have the United Arab Emirates, which actually has done extremely well because in the last 5 to 10 years, you've moved from 35 to number 21. So there's an amazing progression here. And you have the Czech Republic, which has remained actually pretty stable at 24. So there's directions of progress here. If you want to know, China is number 27 in there. And of course, I'm not going to go through the whole list. You have the whole list in that blue report, which has been printed with 1 page per text, which is not the most environmentally friendly thing, but it makes it
Very
thick.
heavy.
Yes, it makes it heavy.
You also check on the internet, whiteshieldpartners.com. The report is now live, in case you want to download it and not carry 1 kilo. with
Okay.
you.
All right. So all of the results of the 123 countries, they're in the report and they're on the website. Now, something to mention also about regions is you actually, if you take these results, you can do averages by region in terms of labor market resilience. Now, keeping in mind we're not doing weighted averages here, so this is basically treating all countries as equals, so keep that in mind. If that's the case, of course, we have a distorted picture of the North America being number 1, mainly because of the pool of United States, which is number 3. Canada is an example of a country which has actually moved backwards. And this is one of the messages in terms of having resilient labor markets, as we'll define it a bit later, is that it's a continuous process of improvement. And you can't just assume that you rest on your laurels once you are in a leading position. And the issue with Canada here has been related to actually acquisition of digital skills is one of the areas, and the skills of workers. So this notion of continuous learning, continuous training that I'm sure we're going to hear about from the panel. Number 2, you saw from the top 10 ranking that it's not surprised that Europe comes out on top. This is related to at least 2 factors. One is the Nordic countries, which are doing something interesting, and that's for the panel to discuss. 2 is this notion of convergence in the European Union. Fadifar was talking about convergence. It has many different meanings, but one of the elements is convergence of policies, which are good practices. And there are several that are happening in European countries. And we're talking about resilience of labor markets. So this is not just employment. You have to keep that in mind. Rank number 3, the East Asia and Pacific, with obviously number 1, Singapore, New Zealand, Korea, Australia, and Malaysia. And it continues, and actually Middle East and North Africa is number 4 in the 7 regions considered, with UAE, which is second in that group. Now, that's the regional perspective. And then we have another notion here which comes out in the analysis of the Global Labor Resilience Index 2019, which is the notion of short-term opportunities for countries for policy improvements to improve the labor markets. Now, how do we measure this? This is measured by differentiating between the structural conditions of the country. So how attractive are the structural conditions in terms of demographics, in terms of economic diversification, and in terms of income inequality? Things that are very difficult to shift in the short term, but are there and are fundamental to resilience of labor markets. And we contrast that to shorter term policies, like acquiring digital skills for the population, improving the business climate for entrepreneurs, putting in place policies to encourage innovation of companies, things that governments can put in with the support of the private sector in the shorter term. And so the logic here is that we're looking at this gap. And what you have here is a top 10 of the ranking of that gap. And you see the category of countries is very different, of course. So you have Uganda, Madagascar, Lebanon, Kyrgyz, and Egypt, which are the top 5 here, and it continues. So Egypt would be one of the top 5 countries in the world in terms of the opportunity. And here we talk, this is one of the 3 key words, is opportunity to improve its labor markets in the short term, if it focuses on the right policies, right? So we have a notion of who are the best practice leaders. That was the top 10 at the beginning. And here we have a notion of where are there short-term opportunities for some countries to improve rapidly. And that's the list of the countries. And if you want the broader list, again, it's in the report. Now, it's about time we answered the question, so what are you talking about in terms of your ranking and of resilience and labor market resilience? So essentially, when we're talking about labor market resilience, it's looking at the situation in which countries are supplying a wide range of work opportunities. So this means wide range in terms of different sectors, different types of work. We look also at the quality of work. So it's not just having any job. And we look at supply and demand. So it's from the worker perspective, but also from the company perspective. And you might be surprised, but this is actually stretching the definition of labor market resilience that you might have in classical literature, like my former organization, which is the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation Development. And in order to frame that, you have structural on the left and policy on the right. Structural includes, as I said, demographics, economic diversification, the level of economic development, inequality. Those are fundamental characteristics of a country. And the other part, the policy, education, labor policy, innovation, technology, entrepreneurship, and even statistics is in there. Because if you can't measure where you are, you can't improve. And this is actually one of the biggest weaknesses that we've seen in countries that need to improve, is actually to measure things that need to be measured now, and they're not. You'll notice also something else, is traditionally when you talk about employment, you talk about Minister of Employment. But in fact today, it has to be broader than that. Other actors from other parts have to work with the Minister of Employment in order to achieve the level of resilience that's needed to withstand the shocks that you have on the markets, which are related to, among other things, obviously, the advances in technology that you all know about. Now, the interesting other thing here is that we've never had such low levels of unemployment in the world in some countries. So in fact, if you look at the statistics in the United States, you're at 4% unemployment. If you look at Germany, you're still at 4% unemployment. So people talking about a big crisis of unemployment, and actually, in the last few years, you have so many examples of countries that are they're actually in situations where it's not a question of unemployment, they're in a situation where they have to fill skill gaps. They have to find workers to come in and replace others who are actually not there to deliver. So this means that we're dealing with a difficult topic in the sense that there are a lot of differences between countries already. Policies definitely matter because you see the different levels of unemployment between countries show that. And we're also seeing that there is a hidden volcano. And the hidden volcano is that there are these forces that are acting right now and that risk actually creating a huge gap between the winners and the others. The winners being those who are flexible, adaptable, who can move and who can shift into these positions that are being created, and the others. And so we do have low levels of unemployment in a number of countries, but this situation risks shifting quite rapidly. And it's the speed with which this is going to happen means that we need to be prepared now, so to be proactive and not be reactive to a situation which is about to come. If you're wondering about the robustness of the Global Labor Resilience Index 2019, a number of tests have been done. First, in terms of the indicators, we have 66 indicators. We have 66 indicators behind this over the 10 policy dimensions. All of them are related to employment in the economic literature, but we retested them later with the model. In addition to that, we did correlations with the index and unemployment. So here you have, this is a sample for OECD countries. We have above a 0.5 correlation with unemployment. And we did correlations with productivity, interestingly. So you have unemployment, productivity. In productivity, the correlations for the global index is 70%, or 0.7. And you were noticing Greece.
So there's only two countries that give you the correlation. There's Spain and Greece. There's no correlation there.
So, okay. Now moving towards the action part. Because here we have, so there's a situation, and there's definitely a need to move forward on how you make your labor markets more resilient from the demand and the supply side. Through the analysis, we see three paths for countries. Three. One is you move up the structural path, which is you address these issues of, for example, economic diversification. You're building the fundamentals. And then you're thinking about employment in terms of shorter term policies. A second path is the policy path, where you say, we don't necessarily have the structural characteristics right now, because part of it is things you can't change from the beginning. We're just going to shift into policy immediately. And we're just going to do everything in terms of education, labor policy, innovation, business climate, to move forward and create work and jobs. In those two examples, you can see structural path. Examples, India and China are two examples of countries which would move towards a structural path and focusing much less on the policy before shifting. And you actually have the UAE in there as well. In the policy path, these are countries like Costa Rica and Georgia who are given as examples, which have done amazing work in terms of the policy direction and now need to shift up on the structural side. But you know what? There's a message of hope also for other countries who are adopting a path in between. And this is the equilibrium path. And I'll show you an example here of the arrow that goes out, and that's the equilibrium, where actually countries are actually managing to balance the two. And if we actually test this and look at which countries are doing what, you have a few examples here. So it's a lot to digest maybe, but here you have the structural path. So those different countries, so you have, you said mentioned China, for example. China over time has moved up and then to the right. India the same, UAE definitely is shifting to the right. Shifting to the right means you're starting to put a huge emphasis on policies after having this structural direction and improvement. Then you, and that is the historical trend. So this is looking at a 10-year analysis of dynamics. And then if you look at the historical trend before, you can see that countries that are up here actually were down there before. And now they're starting to shift to the right. Then you have the ones who focus more on policies first. And then so there you have the examples of Georgia, for example, that I mentioned earlier, Costa Rica. And then you have examples of countries which are more advanced economically, like Norway, which has shifted completely almost to the right and are starting to shift up towards structural. Norway, partly why it's been lower on structural is because of less economic diversification in terms of dependence on one commodity. Even though they're in the top 10, that means they did really well on the policy side. And then you have the beginning emerging ones who are taking a equilibrium path. So they're in the bottom quadrant right now, but here you have Saudi Arabia, which is moving up, and you have Rwanda as an example from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, who is moving up. That is a list and directions for some of the top 10 countries. I will skip that because it will take me 10 minutes to explain it. And move to this picture here. So this picture here is basically telling you, this is the picture of global labor resilience 10 years ago. And then on the left, and on the right, it's the picture of global labor resilience in 2019. And the different colors of the dots represent income levels, so different income levels. Now, if you notice, there's a concentration that's happening. And this is really a positive message, in the sense that there is a beginning of a shift to concentration, right? And a resilience leader, that's where you want to be, means that there's something going on in terms of countries emulating each other and seeing where's the good practice and how do I learn from that and how do I move forward. And that is a positive message that we need to build on and see and ensure that it continues and it happens. Okay, but then you need some action in order to get into a situation where you anticipate and you do not react. First one is long-term vision. And there are many more, but we summarize them down to 7 here for the purposes of this meeting. Long-term vision, and we're applying this to countries as well as companies in terms of where is where's employment going in the next 20 years? Estimating this in a very precise manner and thinking already now about what kind of innovative policies can we have that make you think out of the box in terms of how we can ensure this better matching between supply and demand. And keeping in mind, it's not only a question of unemployment, it's also a question of, on the supply side, making sure we have the right skills that companies need. And this is moving so fast, as you know. In terms of, for example, technology, we have just people that are just being left behind and companies which are looking for the skills and they don't have them. Second, whole of government approach. So it's not one ministry which is going to solve the question of labor market resilience. It has to be Ministry of Economy working with Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Education, and others in collaboration. That's the nature of the importance of what has to happen. 3, collaboration. Collaboration between public, private, and the tertiary sector, not NGOs, institutes, such as the Institute for the Future of Work, and others, who all have different perspectives and ideas and can bring contributions towards solutions. Measurement. Measurement of capabilities, measurement of levels of granularity that we don't have today. You would be amazed that if you try and understand what is happening to the future of work in a sector, like the banking sector, so I say, you don't have the statistics out there. So the basic organizations like the European Union Organization of Economic Development, the statistics are not there to compare, and they absolutely must be if we are to address the balance of supply and demand. Subnational assessment. So having this notion where you can have a concentration of resilience of a country in a place like Paris in France, and then have communities outside which are completely disconnected. And so measurement of what the level of resilience is at the subnational level, another fundamental point. So you're not looking at averages, you're looking at specifics. Big data. Big data, because we do have access to technology now. We can go to a level of precision that we never had before, and we're not using it. We're talking about it, but we're not using it. And one of the ways we could use it more effectively is exactly more effective partnerships between the public and the private, because it's companies often, like the unnameable ones, but that master this approach to big data, and it has to be adapted to areas like the future of work and support of public sector. And then finally, a bit of a controversial one, maybe, but we're not here to. This is closed doors. This is Davos. Nothing is being recorded or filmed, so we say things the way they are. Targeted migration policy. Now, this might be a shock to you, but it means that you don't necessarily have to have the people grown in the country in order to be resilient, and that there are countries. I will give one example: Japan, which, if they had a more targeted migration policy, would be in a very different situation in terms of the resilience of their labor markets. And right now, they're not at the top. Of course, this is a political, it's sensitive, it's all right, but it's something that really has to be incorporated.